Every intelligence agency in the world has a line it claims it will never cross. For Mossad, that line was supposed to be long-term sexual deployment of female operatives. Using a woman's body as a weapon for a weekend to lure a target into a kidnapping was one thing. The agency had done that before and would do it again. But embedding her in a man's bed for years, making her live as his lover, his companion, his confidant, making her cook his meals and wash his clothes and whisper to him in the dark while she memorized every classified document he carried through the front door. That was something else entirely. That crossed from tradecraft into something no training manual had a word for. And yet, in the early 1970s, Mossad did exactly that. They took a 26-year-old woman, erased her identity, rebuilt her from the ground up with a history that never happened and a name that belonged to no one, and sent her into Damascus with one instruction: make a Syrian general fall in love with you. Stay with him. Do not come home until we tell you to. And whatever he makes you feel, remember that none of it is real, even if it starts to feel like it is. Her real name has never been declassified. No journalist has confirmed it. No memoir has revealed it. The Mossad files refer to her only as Yael. She was born in Haifa to a family of Iraqi Jewish origin, Mizrahi Jews who had lived in Mosul for generations before the mass exodus of 1950 and 1951 brought over 100,000 Iraqi Jews to the newly established State of Israel. She spoke Arabic not as a learned language, but as a mother tongue, the dialect of Mosul that her parents carried with them across the border, and that she absorbed in childhood the way most people absorb the sound of rain or the smell of their mother's kitchen. It was not formal Arabic. It was not the Arabic taught in universities. It was intimate, familial, full of idioms and rhythms that could not be faked by someone who had learned the language from a textbook. By the time Mossad recruited her at 23, she had already completed mandatory military service in the Israel Defense Forces, earned a degree in French literature from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and spent a year living in Paris under her real name, working as a translator for a small publishing house. She was not recruited because she was beautiful, though accounts suggest she was attractive in a way that did not demand attention. She was recruited because she was invisible. She had the kind of face that adjusted to its surroundings, the kind of presence that borrowed from whatever room she entered. In a Beirut cafe, she looked Lebanese. In a Paris bookshop, she looked French. In a Damascus salon, she would look like exactly what Mossad needed her to look like: a lonely woman from a good family, looking for a place to belong. The target was Brigadier General Faris Alcadm, a senior officer inside Syria's Military Intelligence Directorate. Alcadm was not famous. He was not political. He did not appear on magazine covers or give speeches on state television or ride in motorcades through the streets of Damascus. He was an administrative ghost, the kind of man who controlled paper instead of people. But the paper he controlled was extraordinarily valuable. He managed deployment logistics for Syrian forces stationed along the Golan Heights, the fortified border region that Israel had seized in the Six-Day War of 1967, and that Syria was quietly, methodically planning to retake. Every troop rotation, every ammunition shipment, every defensive position update, every request for reinforcements or supplies passed through his office before being filed in the archives of the Ministry of Defense. He was not the man who decided where the tanks would go. He was the man who knew where the tanks already were, and for Mossad, that distinction made him more valuable than any general with stars on his shoulders. Mossad did not need a general who knew strategy. They needed a general who knew numbers. Alcadm was that general. But intelligence about his professional value was only half the file. The other half was personal, and it was the personal half that made the operation possible. Mossad's preliminary surveillance, conducted through a network of assets in Beirut who had social access to Syrian officers during cross-border business dealings, painted a very specific picture. Alcadm was 51 years old. He had been divorced for 3 years. His ex-wife, a woman from a prominent Aleppo family, had returned to her relatives after a separation that colleagues described as bitter and prolonged. He lived alone in a government-assigned apartment in the Malki district of Damascus, a quiet residential area favored by senior military and intelligence officials. He drank Scotch whiskey in the evenings, a habit he maintained discreetly, purchasing the bottles through a Lebanese middleman because Syrian military officers were not supposed to drink publicly, and certainly not to be seen buying Western liquor. He attended embassy receptions and official functions when required by his position, but he left early, usually before the second hour. He had no close friends outside the military. He did not travel for leisure. He did not entertain guests. He was, by every metric Mossad could measure, profoundly isolated. And isolation in the world of intelligence is not merely a vulnerability, it is an invitation. This is where the operation began to take a shape that made even some people inside Mossad uncomfortable. The proposal was not simply to place a female operative near Alcadm and hope for useful proximity. It was to construct an entire romantic relationship from nothing, to engineer emotional dependency over months and years, and to maintain that dependency for as long as it took to extract a continuous flow of military logistics intelligence from one of Syria's most sensitive offices. The woman chosen for this would not be conducting surveillance. She would not be planting listening devices or photographing documents with concealed cameras. She would be living with the target, sleeping beside him, learning his habits, his moods, his fears. She would become the most trusted person in his life, and every moment of that trust would be a lie constructed in a building in Tel Aviv by people who would never meet him. The operation was codenamed Marvad, the Hebrew word for carpet. The logic behind the name was never officially explained in any document that has surfaced since. But one former officer, speaking decades later in a recorded interview that was never broadcast, suggested it referred to what Yael would have to do: lay herself down so that others could walk safely over what she provided. Yael entered Damascus in March of 1971 under the name Nadia Sarkis. Her legend, the intelligence term for a fabricated biography designed to withstand scrutiny, was 14 months in the making. She was to be a Lebanese Maronite Christian, the daughter of a deceased Beirut fabric importer, recently returned from several years in France following a broken engagement to a French architect. Every piece of this identity was designed to answer a question before it could be asked. The dead father eliminated the risk of family verification. No one could call a dead man to confirm his daughter's story. The French education explained any slight imperfections in her colloquial Levantine Arabic, because a woman who had spent years in Paris would naturally have a slightly displaced accent. The broken engagement provided an emotional reason for a woman of her age and background to be unattached, and more importantly, it gave her a visible wound. A story of heartbreak that would invite sympathy from the right kind of man. A man who understood loneliness. A man who might see in her reflection of his own. Her first 3 weeks in Damascus were spent doing nothing that looked like espionage. She rented a modest but well-appointed apartment in Abu Rumana, a neighborhood popular with diplomats, foreign residents, and upper-class Syrians. She enrolled in an Arabic calligraphy course at a cultural center near the National Museum. She visited Maronite and Greek Orthodox churches on Sundays. She shopped at the Hamadaya Souk, buying fabrics and scarves with the practiced eye of a woman who had supposedly grown up around imported textiles. She ate alone at small restaurants and smiled at shopkeepers and tipped generously but not extravagantly. She was building what Mossad trainers called a footprint, a pattern of ordinary, verifiable behavior that could be checked by anyone who looked into her background after the fact. If Syrian intelligence ever ran a routine check on Nadia Sarkis, and they ran checks on most foreign residents, they would find a woman who went to class, attended Sunday services, and bought too many scarves. Nothing more, nothing less, nothing worth a second look. The introduction to Alcadm was not left to chance. Nothing in this operation was left to chance. Mossad had identified a Lebanese businessman named Walid Kanj, who operated between Beirut and Damascus, importing consumer electronics, and who had occasional social contact with Syrian military officers through business dinners and embassy functions. Kanj was not a Mossad agent. He was not a recruited asset. He was what the agency internally classified as a useful idiot, a man whose predictable social behavior and wide circle of acquaintances could be exploited without his knowledge or participation. Yael befriended Kanj's wife, a sociable woman named Yael, through the calligraphy class. The friendship developed naturally over shared lunches and afternoon tea. Within 6 weeks, Yael was invited to a dinner party at the Kanj residence in the Meze district. Alcadm was among the guests. He had been gently encouraged to attend by a separate Mossad asset, a Syrian businessman who owed quiet debts to people he did not know were connected to Israeli intelligence, who told Alcadm the evening would be relaxed and that there would be interesting company. Neither Kanj nor Alcadm nor anyone else at the table that night understood that the entire evening, the guest list, the seating arrangement, the casual introduction, had been architected around a single moment. The moment Nadia Sarkis looked across the table and met the eyes of a lonely man who had no idea he had just become the most important person in an operation planned 600 miles away. What happened next followed the pattern Mossad had predicted almost exactly, and that should have been the first warning. Alcadm spoke to Yael for most of the evening. He asked about her time in France. He asked about her father's business. He told her he admired women who were educated. He offered to drive her home at the end of the night. She declined, politely, as she had been trained to do. The refusal was strategic. It transferred the initiative to him. It made the next step his idea. He asked Kanj's wife for Nadia's telephone number the following day. Within 2 weeks, they had dinner alone at a restaurant in the old city. Within 6 weeks, the dinners had become regular. Within 2 months, she was spending nights at his apartment. The courtship moved faster than Mossad's operational planners had anticipated, and internally, this caused concern rather than celebration. A target who falls too quickly is either genuinely vulnerable or performing his own kind of deception. The question that circulated among Yael's handlers in Tel Aviv was one that nobody could answer from a distance. Was Alcadm falling for Nadia because the legend was perfect, or because he was a man who fell for anyone who showed up at his door and made him feel less alone? The answer mattered more than it seemed. If Alcadm was simply lonely and indiscriminate, the operation would produce results, but the intelligence would be shallow. A man who shares his life carelessly with one woman might share it with others. He might talk too freely at social events. He might already be compromised by Syrian counterintelligence running their own test, a planted woman designed to see whether a senior officer could be manipulated through intimacy. But if Alcadm was genuinely attached to Nadia specifically, if his feelings were real and directed and personal, then Yael had something far more valuable than physical access to his apartment. She had influence, and influence, applied carefully over time, could be used not just to read the documents he happened to bring home, but to steer him toward carrying documents he would not normally carry, to make him careless in specific ways, to turn his trust into a pipeline. By the 6th month, Yael had effectively moved into Alcadm's apartment in the Malki district. She kept her own rental in Abu Rumaneh as part of her cover, visiting it occasionally to collect mail and maintain the appearance of independence, but she slept most nights beside Alcadm. She cooked his meals, she pressed his uniforms, she answered his telephone when he was in the shower. She learned which evenings he drank more and which mornings he woke anxious about work. She learned the sound of his breathing when he was troubled and the particular silence he maintained when something at the ministry had gone wrong. This level of domestic proximity gave her exactly what Mossad needed: unsupervised access to his briefcase, his desk, and the papers he brought home in the evenings to review before the next day's meetings at the directorate. The extraction method was deliberately low-tech, almost primitive by the standards of 1970s espionage. Yael did not use a miniature camera. She did not use a radio transmitter or a burst encoder or any of the devices that had contributed to the capture and execution of Eli Cohen in Damascus just 6 years earlier. Mossad had learned from Cohen's death that electronic tradecraft in Syria was a death sentence. The Mukhabarat, Syria's feared intelligence service, monitored radio frequencies constantly, and any unexplained transmission from a residential neighborhood would trigger an immediate investigation, so Yael used no technology at all. She memorized what she read. Troop numbers, unit designations, rotation dates, ammunition requisition forms, logistical assessments of road conditions in the Golan sector. She held the information in her head, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, until she traveled to Beirut on one of her regular visits to shop for clothes and, as Nadia would explain to Alcadm, to visit her mother's grave at a cemetery south of the city. In Beirut, she met a Mossad contact at a cafe near the street, George Hotel, a landmark on the waterfront that served as a favored meeting place for journalists, diplomats, and intelligence officers from half a dozen countries. The contact was a man she knew only by the name he gave her, and she never learned whether it was real. She recited everything she remembered, speaking in low tones over coffee that neither of them drank. The contact wrote nothing down in her presence. He memorized her words, her numbers, her descriptions, and after she left he transmitted them to Tel Aviv through a separate channel that she had no knowledge of and no access to. This method was painfully slow. A single intelligence cycle, from document access to delivery in Tel Aviv, could take 3 to 4 weeks, but it was also nearly invisible. There were no transmissions to intercept, no devices to discover in a search, no dead drops to surveil, no microdots, no coded letters, no hollowed-out coins. The only vulnerability in the entire chain was Yael herself. If she was ever suspected, there would be no physical evidence to find. Only a woman who had been reading papers she was not supposed to read. And in a country where military officers routinely brought classified material home, despite regulations prohibiting it, that alone would not necessarily prove espionage. It would prove curiosity. And curiosity in a lover is not a crime. It is barely even a suspicion. But what Mossad did not know during this period, what they would not learn until much later, was that the operation had already been noticed. Not by Syrian military intelligence, not by the Mukhabarat, not by any of the counterintelligence services that Mossad spent so much energy trying to evade. By someone far closer, someone sitting at the same dinner table. Alcadm had a younger brother named Tariq, a captain in the Syrian army stationed with an infantry brigade in Homs, about 160 kilometers north of Damascus. Tariq visited the capital every few months to see family and attend to personal business, and he had met Nadia on 3 occasions. He did not like her. He never said this to his brother directly, because the relationship between them was not the kind that permitted open criticism of personal choices, but he made comments. He asked questions that Nadia found oddly specific. Where exactly in Beirut had her father's shop been located? On which street? Near which intersection? What was the name of her parish church? Whether she had ever visited the Bekaa Valley, and if so, which towns? Whether her father had imported fabric from Turkey or Egypt or both, and through which port. Yael answered every question correctly. Her legend held under each test. She named the street in Beirut. She named the church. She described the Bekaa with the casual familiarity of someone who had driven through it as a child. But Tariq's suspicion was not about facts. It was about instinct. Something in the way she answered troubled him, though he could not have articulated exactly what. He later told a colleague, in a conversation that was intercepted by Israeli signals intelligence years after the operation ended, that something about Nadia felt rehearsed, that she was too perfect, that no real person remembers their childhood with that kind of clarity and consistency. Real memories contradict themselves. Real people forget the name of their church and remember the color of the door. Nadia remembered everything, and she remembered it the same way every time. That, Tariq said, was not memory. That was preparation. Yael reported Tariq's behavior to her handlers during a Beirut meeting in late 1972. The response from Tel Aviv was divided. Her case officer, the man who had managed her since the beginning of the operation, wanted to continue. He argued that Tariq was a low-ranking officer with no connection to counterintelligence, and that his suspicions, if they even rose to the level of suspicion, had no institutional channel through which to become dangerous. The head of the operations division disagreed. He wanted to begin planning an extraction timeline, not immediate but structured, a 6-month wind-down that would give Yael a plausible reason to leave Damascus without triggering alarm. The argument inside Mossad was not about whether the intelligence was valuable, it was. The deployment schedules and logistics data that Yael had been providing for over a year were feeding directly into Israeli defense planning for what everyone in military intelligence believed was an inevitable Syrian attempt to retake the Golan Heights. The argument was about probability. How long could a woman live inside a lie of this depth and this intimacy before something cracked? Not the legend was solid, not the documents. The documents were being handled with extraordinary care. What might crack was her, the person underneath the performance, the woman who had not spoken honestly to another human being in over 18 months. There was a psychological dimension to this operation that no amount of training could fully address, because no training exercise lasts this long, and no simulation carries real consequences. Yael was not merely pretending to love Alcadm for an evening or a week. She was performing love every single day, in every interaction, without rest, without relief, without a single honest conversation for months at a time. She laughed at his jokes and meant it. She worried about his health and meant it. She lay beside him at night and listened to him breathe and felt something that she could not afford to examine too closely, because examining it would mean acknowledging that the border between the performance and the performer had begun to blur. Her handlers noted in their internal reports that her demeanor during Beirut meetings had changed over time. She was quieter, more withdrawn. She asked fewer questions about the strategic value of her intelligence. She no longer wanted to know how her information was being used or whether it was making a difference. She asked instead how much longer. The answer was always the same. Not yet. The midpoint truth of this operation is not that the cover was blown, or that Syrian intelligence closed in, or that Tariq's suspicions reached the wrong ears. It is something more unsettling than any of those scenarios. The deception worked completely. Alcadm trusted Nadia without reservation. He brought her to military social functions where she stood beside him in rooms full of Syrian intelligence officers. He introduced her to colleagues and their wives. He discussed, in her presence and sometimes directly with her, details of Syrian defense planning that no civilian should have heard and that even many officers of his rank would not have shared with a romantic partner. But the deception worked for a reason that Mossad had not fully anticipated and that Yael herself may not have recognized until it was too late to do anything about it. Alcadm did not trust Nadia because her cover was flawless. He trusted her because he had decided, somewhere deep within himself, in the place where logic meets need, that he could not bear for her to be anything other than what she appeared to be. He was not a fool. He was not naive. Tariq's questions had reached him. He had heard his brother's doubts, expressed in the indirect way that Syrian families communicate disapproval. Small inconsistencies had surfaced on their own, moments that did not require a brother's prompting to notice. A hesitation when someone at a party mentioned a Beirut street name she should have known instantly. A moment where she used a word, a phrase, an intonation more common in Iraqi Arabic than in the Lebanese dialect she was supposed to have grown up speaking. A flicker of something unreadable in her eyes when he talked about the military. A reaction that lasted less than a second, but that a man who had spent 30 years reading people in briefing rooms was equipped to notice. He registered these things, and he chose to explain them away, because the alternative, that the woman sleeping beside him, the woman who cooked his meals and pressed his shirts and made him feel for the first time in years that his apartment was a home rather than a container, was a fabrication sent by his country's enemy, would have destroyed the only thing in his life that still felt real. So he chose not to see. Not out of stupidity. out of survival. The operation was not succeeding because of Mossad's skill alone. It was succeeding because of a man's refusal to look at what was directly in front of him. And that distinction matters enormously, because a deception that depends on the target's willingness to be deceived is not a controlled operation. It is a borrowed one. The operative does not hold the power, the target does. He can revoke his self-deception at any moment, for any reason, and the operative will have no warning when it happens. Borrowed time, in intelligence work, is the most dangerous currency there is. You cannot budget it. You cannot predict when it runs out. And when it does not expire gradually, it collapses. Back in Tel Aviv, the debate over extraction intensified through the final months of 1972. Yael's case officer argued passionately that the intelligence pipeline was too valuable to shut down, especially with tensions along the Golan escalating month by month, and every indicator suggesting that Syria was moving toward a military confrontation. The operations chief countered with a single question that silenced the room. What happens when he stops choosing not to see? No one had an answer. The operation continued. In January of 1973, Yael made a mistake. It was not a dramatic mistake. It was not the kind of error that triggers alarms or sends counterintelligence officers racing through corridors or prompts emergency extraction protocols. It was a domestic mistake, small and ordinary, the kind that only matters when your entire existence is a performance and every room you stand in is a stage where a single misplaced prop can bring down the curtain. Alcadm had returned home early from a meeting at the Ministry of Defense. Yael was in his study. She was not reading his documents, she was replacing them. She had removed a logistics summary from his briefcase 40 minutes earlier, memorized the troop rotation schedule for the southern Golan sector, including unit numbers and projected replacement dates, and was sliding the papers back into the leather folder when she heard the front door open and the sound of his shoes on the hallway tile. She closed the briefcase. She moved to the kitchen. She began cutting vegetables for dinner, a motion so practiced it required no thought. But the briefcase was on the wrong side of the desk. Alcadm was a man of meticulous habit, the kind of man who noticed when a picture frame had been moved half an inch during cleaning. He placed his briefcase on the left side of the desk against the wall every evening without exception. Yael had returned it to the right side, near the lamp. She realized this 4 hours later, lying in bed beside him in the dark, and the realization landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. He said nothing about it. Not that evening, not the next morning over coffee, not that week. And the silence was worse than confrontation because silence from a man like Alcadm could mean two things. Either he had not noticed, which was possible but unlikely given his nature, or he had noticed and was waiting. Waiting for it to happen again. Waiting to see if a pattern emerged. Waiting to decide what it meant. Yael reported the incident to her handler at the next Beirut meeting, 2 weeks later. The handler told her it was nothing. People move briefcases. You are reading too much into it. It means nothing. But Yael knew Alcadm in a way that her handler, sitting in a cafe in Beirut reading operational summaries, never could. She had spent 18 months studying the rhythms of this man's behavior with a precision that went beyond professional observation and into something closer to devotion. She knew the way he aligned his shoes by the front door each night, always pointing outward, always exactly parallel. She knew the way he folded his morning newspaper into exact thirds before setting it on the kitchen table. A man like that notices when something is 2 feet from where he left it. He simply had not yet decided what it meant. Tel Aviv instructed her to pause all document access for 30 days. No reading, no memorization, no contact with the briefcase under any circumstances. She was to become purely domestic for a full month, to let whatever suspicion might exist dissolve into the safety of routine. Yael followed the instruction without objection. She cooked elaborate meals. She cleaned the apartment more thoroughly than usual. She accompanied Alcadm to a reception at the Egyptian embassy, where she wore a blue dress he had chosen for her and smiled at diplomats whose names she filed away out of habit, even though she had no way to transmit them. She laughed at the right moments. She touched his arm in public with the kind of casual possession that signals to every other person in the room that this man is spoken for. For 30 days she was nothing but Nadia, and the performance was so complete and so sustained that it exhausted her more deeply than the espionage ever had, because espionage gave her purpose. It reminded her who she actually was. Being Nadia without that purpose was just being trapped inside someone else's life with no exit and no reason to stay. On the 31st day, she opened the briefcase again, and this time what she found inside changed the entire operation. The documents were not routine logistics reports or standard deployment schedules. They were planning drafts, preliminary staging orders for a large-scale military mobilization along the entire Golan Heights ceasefire line, with detailed coordination notes referencing Egyptian military forces simultaneously massing along the Suez Canal. The dates were not yet specific, but the language was unmistakable to anyone who understood military planning documents, and Yael, after 2 years of reading them nightly, understood them fluently. Syria was not merely maintaining its defensive posture along the Golan. It was preparing for a coordinated two-front offensive in partnership with Egypt. The papers referenced joint command meetings between Syrian and Egyptian military liaisons held in Cairo. They referenced ammunition and fuel stockpiles being moved forward from rear depots to staging positions that only made sense if a major attack was imminent within months, not years. Yael memorized everything she could absorb in the time she had. Unit identification numbers, supply depot locations and capacities, the names of Egyptian officers listed in the coordination memoranda, road infrastructure assessments for armored vehicle movement. She traveled to Beirut 3 days later, earlier than her usual monthly schedule, and delivered the information to her contact in a meeting that lasted less than 20 minutes. What she did not know, what she could not have known from inside Damascus, was that this intelligence was not entirely new to Mossad. Israeli military intelligence, known as Amman, had already received similar indicators from signals intercepts, aerial reconnaissance, and satellite imagery provided by Allied services, but the information from those sources lacked specificity and human confirmation. They knew something was being planned. They could see the movements. They did not know the scale, the timeline, or the depth of coordination between Syria and Egypt. What Yael provided was the connective tissue, the human proof that this was not posturing or diplomatic leverage. It was preparation for war. The intelligence was escalated immediately to the highest levels of Israeli military and political leadership. And here is where an assumption inside Mossad began to distort the operation in ways that would ultimately determine its human cost. Yael's handlers believed that the dramatically increased value of her intelligence would strengthen the case for keeping her in place and would also afford her greater institutional protection within the agency. They assumed that the higher the stakes, the more important she would become, and the more resources would be dedicated to ensuring her safety and eventual extraction. They were wrong. The opposite happened. The moment Yael's intelligence reached the senior desks of Ayman and the Mossad Directorate, she stopped being a person with a name and a psychological profile and a breaking point. She became a pipeline, and pipelines are not extracted. They are not given rest periods or psychological support. They are maintained, optimized, and operated at maximum capacity until they break or until the need for them ends, whichever comes first. Tel Aviv sent new instructions through the Beirut Channel. Yael was to increase the frequency of her document access significantly. She was to look specifically for exact dates, map coordinates, order of battle details, and any references to a joint Syrian-Egyptian command structure or combined operations planning. She was to travel to Beirut every 2 weeks instead of monthly, doubling her exposure to border crossings and the scrutiny that came with them. And she was to do all of this while Alcadm's brother Tariq was now visiting Damascus more frequently than before, reportedly at the request of his own commanding officer, who wanted closer family liaison with senior intelligence personnel in the capital. Yael pushed back. She sent a message through her Beirut contact stating clearly that she considered the new operational tempo dangerously fast and unsustainable. She argued that more frequent Beirut trips would eventually draw direct questions from Alcadm, who had already once commented, with what might have been humor or might have been something else, on why she needed to visit her mother's grave so often. "The grave is not going anywhere, Nadia," he had said. Her handler acknowledged the concern and transmitted it to Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv overruled it. The intelligence was too important. The strategic timeline was too compressed. She was to comply. What followed was the most precarious period of the entire operation. Through February and March of 1973, Yael accessed Alcadm's documents on an almost weekly basis, a frequency that would have been considered reckless even for a professional intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover, let alone a woman whose only protection was a fabricated love story. She varied her methods to reduce the risk of establishing a detectable pattern. Sometimes she read the papers while he slept, standing in the study in the dark with the documents tilted toward the streetlight that came through the window. Sometimes she opened the briefcase while he showered in the morning, memorizing a single page in the 3 minutes before the water stopped. Once, she read a classified document while sitting directly across from him at the dining table, the paper concealed inside a French novel she kept on the bookshelf for exactly this purpose. Each time, she held the information in her memory, carried it in her head across the Lebanese border on a commercial bus surrounded by ordinary travelers, and recited it to a man she knew only as David, who never wrote anything down and never once asked how she was. In April, something shifted. Alcadm came home one evening and did not bring his briefcase. He said it was locked in his office at the ministry. He said this casually while pouring himself a drink, without looking at her. The next day, the briefcase returned to its usual place by the desk. But the following week it stayed at the office again. Then it came back. Then it stayed. Then it came back with fewer documents inside. The pattern was irregular and seemingly random, and Yael could not determine whether it reflected a new security protocol applied to all officers across the directorate or something directed specifically at Alcadm or at her. She reported the change to her handler. Tel Aviv's analysis, prepared by desk officers who had never set foot in Damascus and who understood Syrian military culture primarily through intercepted communications, was that Syrian military intelligence had likely tightened document control procedures across the entire directorate as war planning moved into its operational phase. It was institutional, not personal. A routine security upgrade. Yael was instructed to continue as before, accessing documents when they were available and reporting gaps when they occurred without attempting to pressure Alcadm into bringing materials home. The assessment calmed her handlers. It did not calm her, because she had seen something that the analysts in Tel Aviv, sitting behind desks surrounded by maps and charts, could not see from where they sat. On the evening Alcadm first left his briefcase at the office, he had looked at her when he mentioned it, not past her, not casually toward the window or down at his glass, at her, directly, for a half-second longer than his normal conversational gaze. And then he had changed the subject to something mundane, the weather, a restaurant he wanted to try, and the moment had passed as though it had never happened. That look lived inside her for weeks. She could not report it as intelligence because there was no way to encode a glance into a briefing document. No form for it, no classification level. But she understood what it might mean, and the possibility sat beside her every night in that apartment like a third person in the bed, invisible and permanent. He might know, not everything, not the word Mossad, not the word Israel, but he might know that something about the woman beside him, something fundamental about who she was and why she was there, was not what it seemed. And if he knew that much, then every moment she remained in Damascus was no longer espionage. It was a test she did not control, administered by a man who had not yet decided whether to fail her or protect her, or simply continue pretending alongside her, because the alternative was too painful to face. In May, the briefcase came home every night for 2 straight weeks. The documents inside were detailed, current, and deeply classified, more sensitive than anything she had previously seen. Yael accessed them all. She traveled to Beirut and delivered the most comprehensive intelligence package of the entire operation, a detailed picture of Syrian offensive preparations that left little room for interpretation. Her handler told her that Tel Aviv was extremely pleased. He used that word, pleased, as though she had submitted a satisfactory quarterly report. She asked him again how much longer. He said soon. She had heard that word before. It had never meant anything, and it did not mean anything now. She returned to Damascus on a Wednesday afternoon. Alcadm picked her up at the bus station, which he had never done before in 2 years. He brought flowers, which he had also never done before. And on the drive home through the late afternoon traffic, he asked her a question he had never asked in the entire time they had been together. He asked her if she was happy, not whether she had enjoyed her trip, not whether Beirut was pleasant, whether she was happy. Here, with him, in this life. She said yes, and for the first time since the operation began, she was not entirely sure she was lying. The war came on October 6, 1973. Syria and Egypt launched their coordinated surprise attack on Israel across 2 fronts simultaneously. Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal in a massive amphibious assault that overwhelmed the Bar Lev line fortifications. Syrian tanks rolled across the Golan Heights ceasefire line in numbers that Israeli forward positions were not equipped or prepared to absorb. The Yom Kippur War, as it would come to be called, was the single greatest military crisis Israel had faced since its founding in 1948. And despite everything Yael had provided, despite months of detailed logistics intelligence, staging orders, coordination memos, and unit deployment schedules, Israel was caught off guard. This is the part of the story that never fits neatly into the narrative of a successful espionage operation, and that no amount of institutional self-congratulation can resolve. Yael's intelligence had reached Tel Aviv. It had been read, analyzed, cataloged, and distributed within the most classified channels of Israeli military and political planning. Senior officials in Amman had seen the troop movements she reported. They had seen the ammunition transfers, the Egyptian coordination notes, the forward staging of fuel and supplies, and they had interpreted all of it through a lens that told them what they already believed: that Syria would not attack without first achieving air superiority, that Egypt would not launch an offensive without explicit Soviet military guarantees, that the indicators were diplomatic pressure tactics designed to force concessions at the negotiating table rather than genuine preparation for war. The intelligence was not ignored. That is the crucial and devastating point. It was received, it was acknowledged, it was discussed, and it was subordinated to an institutional assumption that proved catastrophically wrong. The system did not fail to collect the warning, it failed to believe it. Yael was still in Damascus when the war started. She had not been extracted, she had not been warned. She had not been given a contingency plan for this scenario because, incredibly, no contingency plan for wartime had been developed for an operative embedded this deeply in enemy territory. The acceleration of her reporting schedule through the spring and summer of 1973 had been driven entirely by the urgency of the intelligence she was providing. But no one in Tel Aviv had connected that urgency to a corresponding urgency to get her out before the situation she was reporting on actually materialized. She was still useful, and useful assets are not removed from the field during the period when they are most productive. This is the cold arithmetic of intelligence work, and it is the arithmetic that treats human beings as instruments to be used until they break. When Syrian military aircraft roared over Damascus on the morning of October 6th, Yael was in Alcadm's apartment. He had left before dawn without explanation, summoned by a phone call he took in the hallway with his hand over the receiver. After he left, the phone rang twice more, and no one spoke on the other end. She understood immediately what was happening, not because she had been briefed on the attack date, but because she had spent 2 years reading the documents that described exactly this scenario in precise operational detail. The war she had been reporting on for months had arrived, and she was on the wrong side of it. Her Beirut channel was severed within hours of the outbreak of hostilities. The border between Lebanon and Syria, already monitored by both Syrian and Lebanese security services, became effectively impassable for unauthorized civilian crossings. Her contact, the man she knew as David, did not appear at any of the prearranged emergency fallback locations over the following 2 weeks. Oh, she was alone. Not alone as in temporarily unsupported. Alone as in abandoned inside a country that was now actively at war with the country she served. Surrounded by people who would execute her without trial if they discovered what she was. Every Syrian around her was someone she had to smile at, embrace, sympathize with. Every conversation about the war was a minefield of emotional performance. And the man whose bed she shared was now working 18-hour days inside a military intelligence directorate that was actively hunting for Israeli infiltration and sabotage operations within its borders. Alcadm returned home on the 3rd night of the war. He was exhausted beyond the point where exhaustion shows on the face. He did not speak about what was happening at the front. He sat at the kitchen table and drank half a bottle of scotch in silence, staring at a point on the wall that held nothing. Yael sat with him. She poured his glass when it was empty. She said nothing, and in that silence, she performed what may have been the most psychologically difficult act of the entire 3-year operation. She comforted a man who was distressed because his country's war was not going as planned, because Syrian soldiers were being killed and Syrian positions were being overrun on a front line that she had helped Israel prepare to defend. She held the hand of a man whose anguish was real and whose grief was genuine and whose pain had been made possible, in part, by the woman who was now stroking his hair and telling him it would be all right. The intimacy of that moment was not manufactured. It was real in a way that no operational briefing could account for. And that is precisely what made it unforgivable. Not to Alcadm, who never learned the truth during the war, to Yael herself. She remained in Damascus for another 11 weeks after the ceasefire. 11 weeks of performing normalcy while the country around her processed the trauma of a war that had ended in stalemate and humiliation. The extraction, when it finally came in late December 1973, was not dramatic. There was no midnight border crossing through the mountains, no forged diplomatic papers, no helicopter lifting off from a rooftop over the Golan. Mossad reactivated her Beirut channel through an intermediary who appeared at her Abu Rumane apartment with a message disguised as a fabric catalog. She told Alcadm she needed to travel to Lebanon to settle a legal matter related to her late father's estate, a property dispute with a distant cousin. He drove her to the bus station himself. He kissed her goodbye on the platform in front of other travelers, without embarrassment, the way a man kisses a woman he expects to see again in a few days. He told her to come back soon. She said she would. She crossed into Lebanon on a commercial bus, sitting between a student and a merchant carrying boxes of soap. She met her handler in a parking garage in Junia, a coastal town north of Beirut, and was driven south to the Israeli border. She was in Haifa within 48 hours of leaving Damascus. She never returned. She never contacted Alcadm again. Nadia Sarkis simply vanished from his life the same way she had entered it, without explanation, without closure, and without truth. The institutional assessment of Operation Marvad was conflicted and uncomfortable from the start, and it has remained so in the decades since. On paper, the operation was an unqualified intelligence success. Over nearly 3 years, Yael had delivered a continuous, reliable stream of Syrian military logistics intelligence that no other human source, no signals intercept, and no aerial reconnaissance platform had been able to provide with the same level of detail and specificity. She had identified unit deployments, supply chain routes, ammunition stockpile locations, defensive fortification details, and the existence of joint Syrian-Egyptian war planning months before the October offensive was launched. The intelligence she provided was cited in multiple classified post-war reviews as among the most detailed and valuable human intelligence ever collected from inside the Syrian military establishment. But the reviews also noted, with the discomfort of institutions forced to confront their own failures, what that intelligence had failed to prevent. The Yom Kippur War killed over 2,600 Israeli soldiers in less than 3 weeks of fighting. It shattered the doctrine of strategic invincibility that had defined Israeli military thinking since the overwhelming victory of 1967. It exposed catastrophic failures of interpretation at the highest levels of Israeli intelligence, failures that led to a national commission of inquiry and the resignation of senior military and intelligence leaders, and the intelligence that Yael had risked her life, her sanity, and her identity to collect had been absorbed into a system that was structurally and psychologically incapable of hearing what it was being told. The failure was not collection. The failure was interpretation, and for Yael, that distinction offered no comfort whatsoever. She had given 3 years of her life, her identity, her body, and her psychological stability to an operation whose product was filed correctly, distributed properly, and understood completely wrong. Alcadm's fate unfolded slowly and quietly, without spectacle. After Nadia's disappearance, he reportedly spent months trying to locate her through every contact he had in Beirut. He made phone calls. He sent letters through intermediaries. He filed inquiries through Lebanese business associates who owed him favors. He visited Beirut himself in early 1974 and went to the apartment building she had claimed was located near her mother's parish. The building existed. No one living there had ever heard of anyone named Nadia Sarkis. The parish existed. No one named Sarkis had ever been registered as a member of the congregation. He returned to Damascus, and according to intercepted communications that were analyzed by Israeli intelligence years later, he never spoke of her again to anyone outside his immediate family. Whether he eventually understood fully what had happened, whether he pieced together the truth from the fragments of inconsistency he had spent 2 years choosing to ignore, is not confirmed in any declassified record. But his brother Tariq, the one who had asked too many questions at too many dinner tables, reportedly told a fellow officer in 1976 that Faris had changed permanently after the woman left, that he had stopped attending social functions entirely, that he had requested a transfer away from military intelligence to a logistical command post in the eastern desert, far from Damascus and far from anything that mattered, that he never remarried. Yael's debriefing lasted 4 months. The psychological evaluation conducted at its conclusion was classified at the highest possible level, and has never been released to any public archive or declassification review. What is known, from accounts given by former Mossad officers who agreed to speak under condition of anonymity decades after the events, is that she did not return to fieldwork. She was offered a position in the Mossad training division, teaching tradecraft to the next generation of operatives. She declined. She was offered a consulting role within the operations directorate, analyzing ongoing missions from the safety of a desk in Tel Aviv. She declined that as well. She left the agency entirely within a year of her return from Damascus. One former colleague, a man who had known her before the operation and encountered her briefly afterward, described her as someone who had come back from Syria physically intact but fundamentally altered in ways that were difficult to describe and impossible to reverse. She did not speak about the operation. She did not attend agency reunions or commemorations. She reportedly changed her legal name in the late 1970s, not to hide from Syrian intelligence or any foreign service, but to create distance between herself and the person she had been required to become. The operation cost Syria a logistics officer who never fully recovered from the disappearance of a woman who may or may not have been real, and who may have spent the remaining years of his career wondering whether anything in those 3 years had been genuine. It cost Israel an operative who delivered everything that was asked of her, more than was asked, and watched the system she served waste the product of her sacrifice through institutional arrogance and interpretive failure. And it cost a woman whose real name we still do not know 3 years of performed love that she could never fully call a lie and never fully call the truth. 3 years in which the most dangerous thing she faced was not discovery or arrest or execution. It was the possibility that some part of what she felt in that apartment in Malki, in the kitchen and in the silence and in the dark, was not a performance at all. If this story reminded you of something, a relationship that was never quite honest, a trust that was designed from the beginning to serve someone else's purpose, then you understand why espionage at this level is not about technology or tactics or tradecraft. It is about what people are willing to do to other people when the stakes are high enough, and the person giving the orders never has to sleep in the same bed as the consequences. If this is your first time watching Hidden Ops, subscribe. There are more operations like this one. None of them end cleanly. We will see you in the next one.